In New York City, legends often rise from the cracks, whispered in dimly lit bars or shared among children playing in alleyways. Most die off with time, but some cling to the imagination, growing roots. By 1971, the tale of the alligators in the sewers was one such story. First sparked by an incident in 1935, when an 8-foot alligator was pulled out of the East Harlem sewers, the story had evolved from a quirky oddity to a full-blown urban myth. People liked to laugh about it, until the summer of 1971, when the myth reared its scaly head, deadlier and more real than anyone could have anticipated. It was the hottest summer on record. New York was a pressure cooker, and the city streets felt like they were simmering, ready to explode. Crime was rampant, tempers flared, and the subway was a sauna of humid, unbearable heat. And then, people started to go missing. The first to vanish was Paul Kingsley, a construction worker in his late 20s. On June 15, 1971, Paul clocked out after his shift working on a new high-rise downtown. His usual route home took him through a series of winding alleys and down into the subway, which would take him back to his apartment in Brooklyn. But Paul never made it home. His wife, Marie, reported him missing the next morning, but the police, overwhelmed with cases in the heat wave, brushed it off at first. Men go missing all the time, they told her. He'll show up. But he didn't. And he wasn't the only one. Over the next few weeks, several more people disappeared in much the same way, always near subway entrances or sewer grates. A homeless man living in Central Park, 2 teenagers on their way to the movies, a police officer patrolling near the East River. By mid-July, the count had risen to 10, and the city began to take notice. As the heat wave intensified, so did the rumors. People began reporting strange occurrences all over the city. A sewer worker named Eddie claimed he'd seen a giant lizard slithering through the tunnels under Manhattan, its scales glistening like oil in the dim light of his lantern. No one took him seriously, of course, not until he disappeared 2 days later. Others reported hearing odd sounds in the subway late at night, the scraping of claws on cement, the distant splash of something moving through the murky sewer waters. People began to avoid the subway, preferring to sweat it out in the stifling streets above rather than risk the eerie unknown beneath the city. Then, on July 22, a group of teenagers claimed to have seen something horrific in the sewers near East Harlem, where the 1935 incident had occurred. They'd been exploring, daring each other to go deeper into the labyrinth of tunnels when they stumbled upon a massive nest of bones and filth. In the center of the nest, lying in a shallow pool of sewer water, was a creature they couldn't quite describe. Its body was long and muscular, covered in thick, reptilian scales. When it turned its head toward them, they saw its yellow eyes glowing in the darkness. Terrified, they fled and told their story to anyone who would listen. Most people laughed it off, kids with overactive imaginations, running wild during the dog days of summer. But those who knew the legend of the 1935 alligator didn't laugh. They remembered the stories of how the city had once been convinced that alligators roamed the sewers, and now they began to wonder if the legend had been true all along. The tipping point came on August 3, when a sanitation worker named Tommy Connolly made a gruesome discovery. Tommy had been sent to clear a clog in one of the city's main sewer lines, and when he arrived at the site, the stench was unbearable, even by sewer standards. As he dug through the debris, his shovel hit something soft. Curious, he pulled it up. What he found was the body of a young woman, her limbs mangled and her skin covered in deep gashes. Her expression was frozen in a rictus of horror, her eyes wide open, staring into the abyss of the tunnel. Tommy recoiled, but as he backed away, his foot struck something else, another body, this one older, a man with a similar look of terror etched into his face. Panicking, Tommy ran back to the surface and reported his findings to the authorities. The police arrived, and as they scoured the tunnels, they found more bodies, all in various states of decay. Some had been there for weeks, others only days. But the pattern was the same, deep, claw-like gashes on their bodies, as though they had been mauled by some sort of beast. The city was thrown into chaos. People demanded answers, but the police were at a loss. They had no suspects, no leads. All they knew was that something was killing people in the sewers and subways of New York. It wasn't until August 10th that the full horror of the situation was revealed. A city engineer named George Bennett, tasked with investigating the recent deaths, ventured into the sewers armed with a flashlight, a map, and a revolver. George had been fascinated by the 1935 alligator story for years, and while he didn't believe in the myth, he wanted to see for himself what was down there. After hours of wandering through the dank tunnels, George stumbled upon something that made his blood run cold. He had been following a set of strange, large tracks through the muck when he found a tunnel that had been widened unnaturally. The walls were scratched and gouged as if something enormous had forced its way through. As he stepped deeper into the tunnel, he heard a sound, low and rumbling, like the growl of an animal. His flashlight flickered, and for a moment, he saw it, a massive, hulking creature, its body covered in thick, leathery scales. Its mouth was filled with razor-sharp teeth, and its eyes gleamed yellow in the darkness. It was an alligator, but far larger than any he'd ever seen. This was no pet that had been flushed down the toilet. This was something ancient, something that had lived in the sewers for decades, growing larger, more dangerous with each passing year. George turned to run, but the creature was faster. It lunged at him, its jaws snapping shut just inches from his legs. He fired his revolver wildly, but the bullets did little more than enrage the beast. It chased him through the tunnels, its claws scraping against the cement, its breath hot on his neck. Somehow, George managed to escape, but the encounter left him shaken. He returned to the surface, his clothes torn and his face pale, and told the authorities what he had seen. At first, no one believed him, but as more and more bodies were pulled from the sewers, the truth became undeniable. The alligators were real. And they were hunting. As word spread, panic gripped the city. People refused to take the subway, and many fled New York altogether. The mayor declared a state of emergency, and the National Guard was called in to patrol the sewer entrances. But it was too late. The heat wave had driven the alligators to the surface, and they were hungry. Over the next few weeks, the death toll continued to rise. Bodies were found not only in the sewers but in subway stations, parks, and even apartment buildings near the sewer lines. The creatures were everywhere, and no one was safe. In a last-ditch effort to stop the killings, the city launched a massive extermination campaign. Teams of armed men descended into the sewers, armed with flamethrowers and explosives. They blasted the tunnels, collapsing large sections of the sewer system in an attempt to trap the creatures underground. It worked, at least, for a time. The killing stopped, and life in the city slowly returned to normal. But the legend of the sewer alligators never died. In the years that followed, the events of the summer of 1971 became something of a dark joke. People would laugh about the alligator scare, dismissing it as another of New York's many urban legends. But those who had lived through it, those who had seen the bodies, heard the growls, and watched the sewers burn, knew the truth. The alligators were real. They had always been real. And somewhere, deep beneath the city, they still lurked, waiting for the next heat wave to drive them to the surface once again. Because legends, like alligators, are hard to kill.